Well, hello again. It seems somehow we've been drawn out here, my friend. And it doesn't matter how many times we may turn away from the darkness that is ever growing around us, it keeps luring us back, doesn't it? It seeps further over us each and every time, and we try so hard to find protection from it, from whatever may be haunting us out here. And yet, we feel lured out here. Maybe it's that idea of belief and security that keeps us gathering here, waiting for another shudder-invoking story. There are times that I truly wonder, and yet here I am, drawn back each and every time to whatever it is that is calling us to the shadows. I had thought that I would continue on with doing the Excelsior and the Jefferson hotels in Jefferson, Texas. However, I had received a story from mutual friends, a married couple who were wanting to share the personal experiences that they have had with shadow beings. Myself, I have had limited interactions with them, and for that I am grateful because I have heard enough stories and seen enough of them online and in different places to know that they can be terrifying. And this mutual story that my friends have shared with me are unnerving to say the least. And because it's so unnerving, I felt that it deserved to make its own episode. For their protection, I have changed their names to Aaron and Christy, and I do hope that you enjoy or at least take something from their stories. So for this episode, I find it fitting to name it, "The Shadows Are Haunting Me." It's difficult to say when I first realized what shadow people were. I had been haunted by them almost all my life, as far as I can remember, and it took me a while to realize that shadows weren't actually supposed to move separate from what my own shadow did. I may have been 12 or 13 when I had a friend over at my house. They noticed that one of the shadows kept moving on its own and asked me what it was. When I told them that it was just one of the regular shadows that existed around here, they looked at me like I was crazy. "Your shadows move on their own?" they asked me. And I think that's whenever it finally hit me that there may be something wrong here. I had asked my mother about it when I was younger, I remember, but she always told me that I was imagining things. Now that I'm older, I'm starting to wonder if maybe she saw them as well and she was frightened by them. My dad was never in the picture when I was a kid, and whenever I was 11 years old, my parents finally separated, so I never had the chance to ask him about the shadows. I probably wouldn't have anyway because he always struck me as a no-nonsense kind of individual. There is something I do remember from my childhood whenever it comes to him, and that's that they seemed to surround him whenever he was home. You see, my dad was a trucker, and as far as he was concerned, he didn't need to be home. He needed to be out on the road making money. That's what he always said. So whenever he was home, it was odd and tense. And I think I did notice a few times the shadows seemed to surround him. They moved of their own volition whenever he was around. And it scared me, not because of them, but because it felt like he was actually drawing them and making them move in this frantic way sometimes. It was almost like he had his own energy and it resounded with them. But getting back to whenever I was 12 or 13 years old and talking with my friend, the next day we went to the library so that I could do a little bit of research on shadow people. It didn't start out that way. It started out as moving shadows, and somehow I found a book about shadow people and paranormal, and it started from there. The word that stuck with me at that time was an apparitional experience, which is how one of the books described it. Honestly, it made me sound like I was crazy, and so I stopped talking about seeing the shadows move to anybody. That is, except for my friend, who was intrigued by the paranormal at that time and wanted to know more about the shadow people. He started coming over after school more often, and he wanted to try and do experiments. I wasn't sure what he was talking about at the time, but he would go chasing after them and use flashlights to try and get them, or capture them as he would say it. And never had the response that he expected because they would disappear with ease. They would bleed into the walls or they would disappear under a door and just evaporate. How is it that I never noticed that before my friends started doing these experiments? I had never been scared of the shadow people before, but after he started doing that, I was frightened of them. In fact, I begged him to stop doing these experiments, and whenever he wouldn't, I refused to let him back over at my house. It isn't as though they disappeared whenever I stopped letting him come over. In fact, it felt like they focused more on me, and that made me so uneasy that I would beg my mother for a nightlight. She chastised me over that until I woke her up a few weeks later in tears, telling her that I kept having nightmares of somebody trying to touch me, pick me up, carry me away. She finally caved in and got me one. It gave me some small comfort to have it there close to the bed, and I know that the shadows were still there, but it seemed to push them away for a while. I was 15 years old when I remember the first time one tried to touch me. There's a chance when I was younger they did touch me, but I don't remember it, or maybe I blocked it out. I remember that it was late evening and I had just climbed out of the tub to get ready for bed. I noticed that the bathroom door was open and it seemed darker than it usually should be. The house I lived in didn't exactly have the best lights in the hallway, but this seemed darker than usual. And that's when I noticed that there was some kind of darkness curling in from the upper right corner of that door. The longer I stood there and watched this movement there at the door as it seemed to seep into the bathroom then pull back, the more that sensation of terror just increased. I can't say how many minutes passed exactly watching this happen, but I finally gave in to that need to run out of the bathroom and to my bedroom. As soon as I crossed that threshold into the hallway, it grabbed at me. I screamed at the top of my lungs for my mom, even though she was at work, and I ran to my bedroom as quick as I could. The sensation of being grabbed by that thing was cold and thick, and I swear I could feel this hard, nauseating tingle just resonating through me as a response. Again, I didn't tell my mom anything that was happening because she kept calling me crazy anytime I tried to bring this up. The one friend that I did have who didn't think I was crazy had gotten angry with me for refusing to let him come over, so I felt completely alone with this. The internet had only recently come out, and we didn't have a computer at my school for me to use to do any research on this. The only idea I had was to go back to the library and do a little bit of research. But since our school didn't exactly have books about the paranormal and any kind of hauntings there, I would have to go to the city library. And since I had never gone there before, never had a reason to go there before, I felt completely out of my limits here. I will say that the lady who helped me there was pleasant, and if she thought I was crazy, she did not let it show. She helped me to find different types of books whenever it came to paranormal and shadow people, and she even helped to set me up a table. In fact, weeks later, she would be the one to help me to get on the internet and start looking up information there. A couple of pages that came up had more to do with schizophrenia and delusions, things like that, and of course drug use also came up. I was angry and embarrassed to even be lumped into these type of people, but it did make me question myself for a short time. But after a short research on schizophrenia and having delusional psychosis, I realized no, this is not what I'm experiencing. These shadows weren't taking on the forms of people I knew, and I wasn't hearing them say anything to me. If anything, they just seemed to watch me and follow me. From the research that I gathered, most shadow people were curious individuals from some other kind of realm. They could be playful and tricky. Some could even be malevolent. The more research I did on shadow people, the more I started to wonder about the emotional chaos that seemed to go around them. And I realized that whenever I felt some sort of strange emotion I'd never experienced before, that it was usually from them. From my research before, I had read that there are emotional ghosts, or ghosts that leave a sense of dread or sadness behind them for people to feel. They often feel coldness to go along with that, or they'll see shadows, or actually see the individual or ghost that is causing that emotional response. And I realized that the shadow beings were not that different. I realized that night in the bathroom I had felt trapped and hunted because this thing had a malevolent feeling for me. The fact that I had felt that malevolence toward me in other places and times let me know it was probably still around. What I didn't know is if this was a new shadow that was now lurking around, or if this was something that had always been there and had begun to resent me. All I knew after that is that I didn't like being alone in my house, and I told my mom that I was uncomfortable being there in the home by myself. She and I already had a tense relationship, so her response to this was to suggest I go live with my grandmother, and I was glad to do so. My granny was a sweetheart of a lady, and she always welcomed me with open arms, and my mother always had too much going on in her life, so I felt like we could both have a break from each other. My idea was that I could also have a break from the shadow people. Boy, was I wrong. It isn't as though I didn't stay nights over at my grandmother's when I was younger. It was more that I didn't notice the shadows that seemed to hover around her home as well. And what's more, I didn't realize the shadows would follow me from my home to hers. For the first couple of weeks, I didn't experience anything dreadful. If anything, I was starting to relax and actually feel like a teenager because I could focus on school and friends. School had just let out for summer when I had my first encounter with a large shadow being that didn't strike me as a shadow person, but a shadow monster. It was late at night and I'd had a couple of friends stay over so that we could watch a couple of movies and get silly. You know, the typical girl thing. It was pretty late by the time we ended up crashing, and I woke up with a strong need for a drink. Trying to keep from waking my friends up, I padded from the living room where we had all knocked out to the kitchen and was getting myself a glass of water whenever I saw it staring at me. And yes, I could tell it was staring at me even if I didn't see eyes. It was this large, looming darkness, inky black against the shadows. I had never seen anything like that before. Most of the shadows I had seen before were dark to the point that they looked opaque, like you could reach out and touch them. But they were small, like the size of a mouse or a dog, or sometimes even a child. This, whatever it was, looked to be over 8 feet tall and twice the size of a human being, and it was looming. What's more is I could feel the hate resonating off of it toward me. I did the only thing that I could think of at that time, and that was to say a prayer and tell it was no longer welcome in my grandmother's house, that I no longer wanted to see it, and I no longer wanted it around me. It seemed to dissipate by drawing back into the corner and just fading away. That's the only way I can describe it, is just fading away, like the corner had just sucked it up like a vacuum. I was shaking and in tears and thought maybe it had finally gone away for good. Unfortunately, I would see it a few more times at my grandmother's house, and I would have the same response of saying a prayer, telling it that it was no longer welcome and that I no longer wanted to see it. I did notice that saying a prayer would sometimes cause the lesser beings to disappear, but this, for some reason, just would not go away, and that terrified me. I was in my bedroom, and it was there in the shadows watching me from the closet, and I began to cry and rock back and forth. My grandmother heard me and came in to ask me what was wrong, and I told her that there was something scary in the closet. And I honestly did not expect her to believe me because nobody else had at this point. My grandmother told me that she was going to light some sage and she was going to put some salt around the room and for me to open the windows. I asked her what she was talking about, and she told me that we were going to do the Lord's Prayer in every room of the house while she sprinkled salt and saged the area, telling me that yes, she saw shadow people too, yes, they were constantly around, and she didn't realize that I had been experiencing them like she had. In fact, before my grandfather died, he had been seeing them for quite a while as well. I can't begin to tell you the sense of relief that I had after she told me that. The fact that I was one of the few people who could see these creatures and couldn't find anybody else nearby, it had left me feeling alone for the longest time, and now here I had my grandmother telling me not only could she see them, but she knew how to deal with them in her own way. She sat me down and explained that she had been experiencing them almost all of her life as well, and she explained that whenever we saw these beings, they weren't always human spirits that we were seeing, but sometimes emotional conjurations that had built up into something negative. What's more, she thought that some of them could be demonic. Now, I was never big into church, so the whole idea of angels and demons didn't do much for me, but when my grandmother said demonic, it resonated with me in a whole different light. Did I believe they were demons then? I don't know. Do I believe that they are demons now? not so much, but I do believe that they are dark and can be dangerous. In fact, this is how I wound up meeting Aaron. I was badly wanting to do research on what these things were and found him doing the exact same thing. Since he was a child, Aaron has had his own unique brushes with the supernatural. However, he doesn't like to talk about them, and I make a point of not forcing him to tell me anything. I respect those boundaries because I know how terrifying they can be. As time has gone by and we've gotten closer, he's told me more and more about his childhood and the things he has seen. He has seen family members walking around his place or even at their home after their passing. He has been at a friend's place or been at a strange location and has seen full figures of individuals. And I'm not just talking about their outline or their figure. I mean that he has seen the full vision of them before. He said that a few of them have even talked to him, and it terrified him whenever this happened. In fact, he didn't see his first shadow person until he was 10 years old and he was at a friend's house. For the sake of the story, we'll call the friend Billy. It was summertime and Aaron had gone over to his house to play. They had an add-on garage that was recently built, and Billy's family kept a refrigerator that was full of drinks for the kids. That way the kids wouldn't go storming in and out of the main house. He and Billy were standing in front of the refrigerator door and they were discussing what they were going to do when they went back outside. They were basically cooling off a little bit before they went back to play, and that's when Billy all of a sudden stiffened and said, "We should go outside right now." As soon as he shut the refrigerator door, he noticed that there was a shadow of something in the corner. And so Aaron called over there to it, "Hey, we can see you." At that time, Aaron had thought it was Billy's little brother or sister coming out there to play a prank on them. However, that shadow suddenly rose up larger than what they were and charged toward them. Immediately, both boys ran outside screaming and did not go back in that garage without somebody else going in there with them. Aaron said he also never went back over to Billy's house. Not that it mattered, because whatever that shadow was attached itself to Aaron and followed him home. Aaron said that night, as he was lying in his bed reading a comic book, he glanced at his door and saw that it was darker than it should be. He also said it felt like something was standing there just watching him. And the more he stared at the darkness, the more it felt like it was moving and about to come at him. The feeling did eventually go away and he went to sleep with no problem, but that feeling seemed to intensify night after that. He said it wasn't long after that it moved into his room and he felt like it was actually standing over him sometimes. Or, even worse, it would be in the corner of his room. It's like it just merged into the corner and became its own figure, he said. And sometimes it would start out small, but it would grow and become larger than a person. And each time, he said he felt threatened by it. This went on for weeks before Aaron finally went to his parents and told them what was happening. They immediately went to their priest. They had the house blessed, they had it cleansed, and the priest gave him a cross telling him, "If this happens again, you tell your parents, they will come to me, and we will do all of this over again." That shadow did disappear, but he said after that, every now and then he would still see small shadows, but he didn't feel as threatened by those as he had by the larger one. In fact, there were times that he actually felt comfortable with their presence, and so he didn't do anything against them, didn't even notice their presence or acknowledge them. As the years went by, he would feel that threatening sensation of that dark presence, and he would go tell his parents, "Hey, I think it's back," or "There's something new." And each time they would go to the priest and they would go through the whole cycle of having the house blessed and cleansed, and they would give him another cross. The issue arose when Aaron realized he was about to go out of state to university and he couldn't rely on his parents to constantly take care of him. So he thought he would do his own research on what he could do, figure out what these shadow beings were, and try to find a way to stop them himself. From what he had read, parapsychologists said that shadow people were like humans. They were made of light and dark, and they were drawn to light and dark in humanity. And coming from a scientific point of view, emotions are basically energy that humans are created, hence why the shadow beings were being drawn to them, because they were being drawn to that energy. And while they were thought to be their own form of energy and be able to create their own emotional push out, their type of energy or form of it isn't as strong as what a human's is, and that's why they were pulled to the human's emotions or that energy that they were putting out. I'm not saying that I believe that or don't believe it. It's a lot to take in, though. What I do know is that Aaron and I sat at that table at that library for hours discussing this. And while I didn't know it at the time, that would turn out to be our first date. It was almost a year later that we joined a paranormal group and decided to go on investigations to see what more we could find out. Looking back on that now, I understand that was one of the dumbest things we could have done, but we were curious and we thought the only way we could find more information was by going and researching the different type of ghosts and ways that we could fight against them or keep ourselves protected from them. There were 7 of us at the start, and I actually think that worked in our benefit because we all brought something to this. We all had different prayers that we used. We had different techniques to keep ghosts from attaching to us or to protect ourselves from something demonic even. Not everybody in the group had dealt with a shadow being before, but those who had all experienced the similar reactions, emotions, and that unease because there was usually a large one that had either touched them or made them feel uncomfortable, and at times even made them feel hunted. As I said earlier, it had been a mistake for us to join that group because things were starting to follow us home. Before, when we were younger, we might see a shadow person maybe once a week or twice a month. Now we were seeing them almost daily. And those weren't the only things that were following us home, but it felt like those were some of the most threatening and scariest things at time. We were young and stupid enough to believe at that time that we could handle it. There was nothing going to stop us. We were getting the investigations we wanted. We were getting proof of these dark entities and shadows. And then something happened to make us realize maybe we were being really foolish. By this time, Aaron and I were openly dating, and I had met his family. He had met mine. I had been invited over to his grandparents' house for Thanksgiving. I thought going over there would be neutral territory and that we would be safe, and I was wrong. I only met Aaron's grandfather a handful of times before his passing. He was a no-nonsense type. He was ex-military, and he didn't believe in the supernatural or in anything outside of what he saw. In fact, he was the first Christian I'd ever met who didn't believe in angels and demons. Almost as soon as Aaron and I walked into his house for Thanksgiving that day, there was this immediate sense of something being wrong, but we couldn't put our finger on whatever it was. I thought at first it might be family tension, but as the day went and it got darker, it felt like that unease just built. The family had been having a good time. We were all laughing, sharing stories, so there was no real good explanation as to why that unease was building the way it was. But Aaron and I could both tell that it was taking its toll on his grandparents and even Aaron's parents. By late evening, we were wrapping everything up, and Aaron's grandfather was gathering the trash to take outside. What should have been a 2 or 3 minute chore extended out to 25 minutes. And when his grandfather finally came back in the room, he was pale and shaking. He wouldn't tell us what he saw out there, but his grandmother seemed to know already. She had come across something in the house and was hesitant to talk about it with anybody. A few weeks later, Aaron's mom would tell him that Grandma was seeing shadows as well. And it makes me think that maybe the whole family had been seeing shadows for a very long time and nobody was admitting it to each other. They had had a priest come out there to bless the house, but apparently it didn't take, or it wasn't having the effect that it had had for Aaron, because whatever was there was not only hanging around, but seemed to be getting stronger. It took a lot of time and effort for us to cajole Aaron's grandma into letting us come over with the offer of helping her. I think that Aaron's grandfather, seeing the shadows, finally convinced her she wasn't going crazy and that it was okay for us to come out there and help her. But we seemed to make it worse for his grandparents, and for that I feel deeply guilty. We still aren't completely sure what it was his grandmother was experiencing, but Aaron's grandmother is pretty sure it was a demon. Her husband may not believe in them, but she certainly did, and she made sure there were crosses in every room. Unfortunately, after that thing left his grandmother's house, it decided to find Aaron and me. We weren't yet living together at that point, but it didn't matter because it would find us in our respective homes and it would torture us in its own little way. I mentioned before that I had been touched by one. It felt nothing at all like the dark, oily sensation that this one left behind when it touched me. The first time I felt it touch me, I was in bed in a deep sleep whenever that dark sensation came over me. At first, I thought it was a horrible dream until I realized that sensation was intensifying. What was worse is not only could I see the outline of the dark figure hovering over me, but I could see dark red eyes. And yes, I had seen eyes before, but not to this intensity. And I think that's what scared me more, is that this felt more real, more present than the others had before. I actually felt like this thing, whatever it was, wanted something from me, or it just wanted me. And whenever I asked Aaron about that, he said he had that same sensation from it. For months, we endured this thing hanging around. Neither of us felt safe no matter where we went because it always felt like it was with us. It took months of us using different cleansing techniques, different prayers, different ways to try to get rid of it before it finally took effect, and whatever it was finally left us alone. By that point, I think Aaron and I had got the clue that we needed to leave all of this alone, and we just needed to move ourselves away from all of it as much as we possibly could. We already knew that we would never fully be able to get rid of the shadow people. They would constantly hover around, and that Aaron would constantly be able to see ghosts and other spirits. That would be something we would never fully be able to get rid of. But the less that we fooled around with paranormal investigation, opening our arms and our homes to whatever these things were, the less they were likely to notice us and want to be drawn to us. I think what was the final closing door on the whole situation was when I became pregnant and we realized that whatever we were pulling into the house would affect our future child. We had already been terrified as children, and we didn't want our child to be affected the same way. So when we finally moved in together, we made a point of cleansing the area and making sure that it was a safe place for us. That did take a lot of time and detail just because we knew that there were different entities out there that could try to affect us. But in the long run, it has seemed to help. My son and daughter haven't been as affected. They do every now and then see something, a shadow, a spirit, but it's never been as terrifying as what Aaron and I experienced. We also make a point of regularly cleansing our home. That way, whatever is out there knows that we are serious about keeping it out. And anytime we do see a shadow being, we make a point of acknowledging that we have seen it, but we don't acknowledge it. We're the same way whenever it comes to a spirit or another entity that may come through the house, because yes, we recognize that it is there, but we don't want it to recognize that we've seen it. I understand and I respect that there are people out there that not only want to talk to the spirits, but that they open their arms to the spirits and even to those shadow people. But I have to warn them that if you do that, that you are also opening your arms up to the darker side of the spirit world. And if you're going to do that, then make sure that you're protecting yourself. We didn't do that, and it's obvious now that whatever we were trying was a poor attempt. Does that kill our interest in the paranormal side of things? Definitely not. But we also don't go seeking it out anymore. That's what we have scary stories and podcasts for. Once again, I want to thank Aaron and Christy for sending in this story to me. They've shared some of their personal stories with me about their investigations. Those stories will make your hair stand on end. They have run into some truly haunting visages before, and the tales they have told about why those places were haunted, they will make you shiver. I will take on Christy's advice here and say that you really should not go investigating unless you know you are protected. Going somewhere that you know is haunted, especially if you are a first-time investigator, doesn't mean that it's okay for you to immediately jump in and start an investigation without doing your research first. As somebody who is trained and has gone on investigations, there have been times that I've brought something home. As Christy said, play it safe. But on a lighter note, if you're interested in more haunting tales instead of going to find the ghosts yourself, then you really need to go check out the ghost lore of Hawaii. Uncle Jared is one of the most amazing storytellers I've ever known, and he gives a lot of information about Hawaii. He loves to give a lot of information about the history and mythology of the area, along with the ghost stories, and a lot of them are personal stories. He's on a lot of apps that have podcasts, but I actually like to go to his website, Ghost Lore of Hawaii, to listen to them. He even has his own Patreon, and I heavily suggest going to support him. If you're interested in something a bit closer, then you should also go check out Texas Ghost Tales by Jonathan Wright. The podcast goes over a lot of the great hauntings along Texas, and if you're one of those individuals who likes to visit haunted places, and if you're one of those individuals who likes going to haunted locations to check them out, this is the perfect one for you. As always, I will have links to these podcasts in the descriptions below. For my next episode, as promised, I will be discussing both the Excelsior and the Jefferson Hotel, as well as sharing personal experiences that I and friends have had in both those locations. And as always, if you have a personal story or if you have a location that you would like me to discuss, please send me an email at podcastintheshadows.com, or you can go to our Facebook page, In the Shadows, a Paranormal Podcast. To those who have sent me personal stories, I promise that I do intend to share them. A few people I have reached back out to, and I'm simply waiting for your confirmation that I have the permission to share them on the podcast. But now I fear that the evening has grown rather late, my friends. We've sat out here for quite a while sharing this story, and I'm afraid that whatever has been in the shadows has been pulling closer to us, hovering on the edge, and waiting to pull us into the dark unknown with it. So for now, my lovely friends, I do wish you a good night, sleep tight, and don't let the ghouls bite.